I knew this case would be dirty the moment I saw his shoes, not because they were expensive or flashy, but because they were worn down at the heels in a way that suggested a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. In Miami, everyone believes in the American dream until they learn the price of that dream. Michael Brennan sat across from my desk in downtown Miami, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to explain why he suspected his wife of having an affair. The thing about betrayal is that it changes the very air you breathe. I'd learned that lesson 15 years ago when my own wife had decided that a personal trainer's promises were more valuable than a detective's pension. Now I could smell betrayal on Michael Brennan like cheap cologne, desperate, obvious, and impossible to ignore. "Mr. Hunt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I teach high school chemistry. I make $38,000 a year. I can't afford your regular rates, but I need to know the truth about what my wife is doing." Michael was maybe 52, with the kind of tired face that came from 20 years of dealing with teenagers who didn't want to learn chemistry and administrators who didn't want to pay teachers what they were worth. His clothes were clean but cheap. His watch was digital plastic, and his wedding ring looked like it had been bought at a department store 20 years ago. In a city where status was measured by the cost of your car and the address on your business card, Michael Brennan was invisible, exactly the kind of man that ambitious women married young and divorced older. But there was something in his eyes that reminded me of myself 15 years earlier, when I'd been sitting in a lawyer's office, listening to my own wife explain why she was taking our children and disappearing with her personal trainer. The look of a man who'd built his entire life around his family, only to discover that his family had been planning to exist without him. "Tell me about your wife," I said. "Victoria, we've been married for 20 years. 2 kids. Emma's 16, James is 14. Michael pulled out his wallet and showed me a family photo that looked like it had been taken at a shopping mall studio. 6 months ago, Victoria started acting different. Different how? She's been taking these online courses. Business development, she calls it. Spends hours on video calls with people I've never met. Gets packages delivered that she won't let me see. Last month, she said she needed to go to Switzerland for a business conference." "Switzerland?" "Some kind of international investment seminar. She was gone for a week. Came back with expensive clothes and jewelry that we definitely can't afford on my salary." Michael reached into a manila envelope and pulled out bank statements, credit card bills, and what looked like travel documents. "Mr. Hunt, my wife wants a divorce. She's demanding full custody of the kids, saying I'm not stable enough to care for them. But I think she's planning to take them somewhere I can't follow." I studied the documents Michael had brought. Credit card charges for luxury hotels, first-class plane tickets, and shopping sprees that totaled more than Michael's annual salary. But what caught my attention were the travel records. Victoria had made 3 trips to Zurich in the past 4 months, each time staying at the 5-star Bor-au-Lac Hotel. "Miss Brennan, have you confronted your wife about these expenses?" "She says she's building a business that will provide financial security for our family, that I'm too small-minded to understand international opportunities, that maybe it's time for her to find someone who shares her ambitions." The way Michael said those words told me he was repeating something Victoria had said to him, probably during one of those conversations that destroyed marriages one cruel sentence at a time. "What makes you think she's having an affair, as opposed to just hiding a business from you?" Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph he'd apparently taken without Victoria's knowledge. It showed her having dinner at an expensive restaurant with a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a European fashion magazine, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "His name is Klaus Weber. I found his business card in Victoria's purse. He's listed as an international investment consultant based in Zurich." I looked at the photograph and felt that familiar itch that came when a case was more complicated than it appeared. Victoria Brennan wasn't just having an affair, she was having an affair with someone who had the resources to help her disappear with 2 children and enough money to start a new life anywhere in the world. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to be honest with you. If your wife is planning to take your children to Switzerland, you need more than a private investigator. You need a lawyer, probably a federal prosecutor, and definitely more money than you can afford. That's why I'm here, Mr. Hunt. You're my only chance to find out what she's really planning before it's too late to stop her. I quoted my international rate and watched Michael's face fall. It was more money than he made in 3 months, more than he could borrow, more than his family could survive without. But there was something about his situation that reminded me too much of my own history to walk away. Mr. Brennan, do you have any family in Switzerland? Any connection to the country that might explain why your wife chose Zurich for her business activities? Actually, yes. My father's brother, Robert, moved to Switzerland in the 1970s. He was some kind of engineer, worked for international companies. We lost touch years ago, but I think he's still there. Any idea what happened to him? Last I heard, he'd done well for himself. Never married, no children. My father used to joke that Robert was too busy making money to make a family. I made a decision that was either very smart or very stupid. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to take your case, but not at my international rate. I'm going to charge you my domestic rate, and I'm going to find out what your wife is really doing in Switzerland. Why would you do that? Because I've been where you are, and I know what it feels like to lose your children to someone who's planning to take them somewhere you can't follow. Michael's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he looked like the 16-year-old son he was trying to protect. Mr. Hunt, I can't lose my kids. They're all I have left. That evening I sat in my apartment going through the documents Michael had given me, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to involve Swiss banks, international investment schemes, and a chemistry teacher's wife who'd apparently decided that her husband wasn't ambitious enough for her new lifestyle. But there was something about the timeline that bothered me. Victoria's transformation from housewife to international businesswoman had happened very quickly, almost like someone had given her a script to follow. And her relationship with Klaus Weber felt less like a romance and more like a business partnership. I called my contact at the Swiss consulate in Miami, a woman named Ingrid Weber, who'd helped me with a previous case involving international custody disputes. "Riley Hunt," she said when she picked up the phone. "I was wondering when you'd call. International cases are becoming your specialty." "Ingrid, I need information about a Swiss national named Klaus Weber, investment consultant based in Zurich." "What kind of information?" "The kind that tells me whether he's legitimate or whether he's running some kind of confidence game on American tourists." "Give me 24 hours. But Riley, if this involves American citizens in Switzerland, you need to be very careful. Our laws are different, our police are formal, and our legal system doesn't have much patience for foreign private investigators who don't understand how things work here." The next morning, Ingrid called back with information that confirmed my suspicions about Klaus Weber. "Your Mr. Weber is what we call a legacy hunter," she said. "He specializes in finding wealthy Swiss citizens who died without clear heirs, then helping foreign relatives claim inheritances through our legal system." "Is that legal?" "It's legal if the relatives are legitimate and the claims are valid. It's not legal if the relatives are fictional and the claims are fraudulent." "What kind of money are we talking about?" "Swiss bank accounts from the 1970s and 1980s can contain substantial sums, especially if they've been earning interest for decades. A successful legacy claim could be worth hundreds of thousands of Swiss francs, possibly more. And if someone wanted to fake a family relationship to claim an inheritance? That would be fraud, Riley. The kind of fraud that results in very serious criminal charges and very long prison sentences." After hanging up with Ingrid, I called Michael at the high school where he taught and asked him to meet me during his lunch break. We sat in his empty classroom, surrounded by periodic tables and chemical equations that suddenly seemed less complicated than his family situation. "Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you about your Uncle Robert. When was the last time you had contact with him?" "Maybe 15 years ago. He sent a Christmas card, mentioned that he was thinking about retiring." "Why?" "Because I think your wife might be planning to claim an inheritance that belongs to you." Michael stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "What inheritance? Robert and I barely know each other." "That's exactly what would make you the perfect mark for a legacy fraud scheme. Klaus Weber specializes in helping people claim Swiss inheritances from relatives they've lost touch with. If Robert died and left money in Swiss banks, Victoria might be planning to claim it using forged documents that establish your family relationship. But Robert's not dead." "How do you know?" Michael opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. I guess I don't know. I just assumed—" "Mr. "Brennan, I think your wife and Klaus Weber are planning to fake Robert's death, claim his inheritance using your family connection, and disappear with the money and your children. The question is whether we can prove it before they succeed." That afternoon I made arrangements to fly to Zurich. Michael couldn't afford to pay for an international investigation, but I'd decided this case was personal enough to invest my own money in solving it. Besides, I had a feeling that Robert Brennan might be the key to understanding what Victoria was really planning. The flight to Zurich was my first time traveling to Switzerland, and I spent most of the 9 hours reading about Swiss banking laws, inheritance procedures, and the kinds of fraud that international criminals used to steal money from wealthy families who'd lost touch with each other. But reading about Switzerland and experiencing it were entirely different things. The descent into Zurich airport gave me my first glimpse of the country that would dominate the next phase of this investigation. Snow-capped mountains that looked like they'd been carved by gods with unlimited time and infinite patience, a lake that reflected the sky like polished silver, and a city that seemed to have been designed by architects who believed that beauty and efficiency were the same thing. Switzerland in November was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like I'd prepared for. The airport was efficient to the point of being intimidating. Signs in 4 languages, clocks that showed the exact time down to the second, and customs officials who examined my passport like they were reading a doctoral dissertation on international law. Everything moved with clockwork precision, but there was something almost oppressive about the perfection, like being inside a machine that had been designed to eliminate human error. The train from the airport to downtown Zurich was clean, quiet, and filled with people who looked like they'd never been late for anything in their lives. I'd grown up in Miami, where public transportation was an adventure that required patience, humor, and a willingness to accept that schedules were more like suggestions than commitments. Swiss public transportation was the opposite, precise, reliable, and operated by people who seemed to take personal responsibility for every minute of delay. Outside the train windows, Lake Zurich stretched toward mountains that disappeared into gray clouds, while the city itself looked like someone had taken a medieval town and updated it with the most expensive architecture money could buy. Ancient churches stood next to modern bank buildings, while narrow cobblestone streets accommodated both horse-drawn tourist carriages and luxury cars that cost more than most Americans' houses. My hotel was modest by Zurich standards, which meant it cost more per night than I usually spent on food in a week. The Helvetia Hotel was a small establishment near the old town, chosen specifically because it was the kind of place where American tourists stayed when they wanted to experience authentic Swiss culture without actually roughing it. The lobby was decorated with traditional Swiss textiles, carved wooden furniture, and photographs of alpine scenes that looked like postcards come to life. But it was the details that really drove home how foreign this environment was for someone like me. The elevator required a room key to operate. The shower had instructions in 4 languages. The television offered programs in German, French, Italian, and English. But even the English programs seemed more formal and serious than what I was used to watching in Miami. The first challenge was the language barrier. My German was limited to what I'd learned from World War II movies, and while most people in Zurich spoke excellent English, conducting surveillance in a foreign language was like trying to solve a puzzle while blindfolded. Conversations that I could have followed easily in Miami became incomprehensible murmurs when conducted in rapid Swiss German, and I found myself relying on body language and facial expressions to understand what people were discussing. The second challenge was the culture. Miami was a city where people's business was everyone's entertainment, where loud conversations and obvious emotions were part of the daily landscape. Zurich was a city where people conducted their affairs quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of discretion that made private investigation feel like an intrusion on a well-ordered society. I discovered this cultural difference on my first morning in the city when I attempted to strike up a conversation with other hotel guests during breakfast. In Miami, breakfast was a social experience. People shared tables, exchanged stories, and treated strangers like friends they hadn't met yet. In Zurich, breakfast was a solitary ritual conducted in near silence, with each guest focusing on their meal and their newspaper while maintaining careful distance from everyone else. "Excuse me," I said to a middle-aged businessman reading the Financial Times at the table next to mine. "I'm visiting from America. Could you recommend any good restaurants in the area?" The man looked up from his newspaper with the kind of expression typically reserved for people who'd been asked to donate a kidney to a stranger. "There is a tourist information office near the train station," he said in perfectly accented English. "They provide restaurant recommendations." That was the entire conversation. In Miami, such a question would have led to a 20-minute discussion about different cuisines, price ranges, and personal dining experiences. In Zurich, it led to a polite but definitive redirect to official information sources. But the biggest challenge was finding Victoria Brennan in a city where I didn't know the neighborhoods, didn't understand the social customs, and couldn't blend in with the local population. I was obviously American, obviously out of place, and obviously the kind of person who attracted attention from police officers who preferred their city to remain orderly. This became apparent on my first day of surveillance, when I spent 3 hours following a woman I thought was Victoria through the narrow streets of the old town, only to discover that I'd been following a Swiss banker who resembled Victoria from a distance but bore no closer similarity upon examination. The Swiss police officer who approached me after this incident was polite but firm in his questioning about why an American tourist was following local citizens through the historic district. "I'm a private investigator working on a case involving American citizens," I explained, showing him my credentials and passport. "Do you have permission from Swiss authorities to conduct investigative activities in our country?" Officer Weber asked in English that was more grammatically correct than most Americans used. I wasn't aware that permission was required for surveillance of American tourists. "Surveillance of anyone requires proper coordination with local law enforcement, Mr. Hunt. We appreciate international cooperation, but we also appreciate proper procedures." Officer Weber was maybe 40, with the kind of serious demeanor that suggested he'd spent his career dealing with foreign visitors who didn't understand that Switzerland operated according to rules that were both stricter and more consistently enforced than what they were accustomed to in their home countries. What would proper procedures involve? Contact with the cantonal police, explanation of your investigation's purpose, coordination with American consular officials, and agreement to operate within Swiss legal guidelines. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Officer Weber explained that Swiss law enforcement took a dim view of unauthorized foreign investigators, that international cooperation required extensive paperwork, and that violations of investigative protocols could result in deportation and lifetime bans from entering Switzerland. However, he concluded. "If your investigation involves American citizens who may be violating Swiss law, we would be interested in coordinating our efforts with yours." "What if it involves American citizens who are definitely violating Swiss law?" Officer Weber's expression became considerably more interested. "In that case, Mr. Hunt, I think you should speak with Inspector Mueller, who specializes in international financial crimes." My first lead came from the concierge at the Bourg-au-Lac Hotel, where Victoria had stayed during her previous visits. The concierge was a thin man in his 60s named Herr Zimmermann, who spoke English with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been practicing it for decades. His office was located behind the hotel's main desk, decorated with photographs of famous guests who'd stayed at the hotel over the past century. Politicians, movie stars, business leaders, and royalty from countries that no longer existed. "Yes, Mrs. Brennan has been a guest here several times," he said when I showed him Victoria's photograph. "She's always very well dressed, very polite, and always accompanied by Mr. Weber." "What can you tell me about Mr. Weber?" Herr Zimmermann's expression became carefully neutral, the kind of professional discretion that hotel concierges developed after years of protecting wealthy guests' privacy. "He's a regular client of the hotel. Stays here frequently with different business associates. Always pays cash. Always requests our most discreet accommodations." "Discreet how?" "Mr. Weber's business sometimes requires privacy. Our hotel is equipped to provide that privacy for clients who value confidentiality above publicity." "Is Mrs. Brennan registered here now?" "I'm not permitted to share guest information with unauthorized individuals, but I can tell you that the hotel restaurant serves excellent Swiss cuisine, and many of our guests enjoy dining there in the evenings between 7 and 9 o'clock. The subtext was clear. If I wanted to observe Victoria and Klaus, the hotel restaurant would be my best opportunity. That evening, I positioned myself in the hotel bar where I could observe the restaurant entrance without being obvious about it. The bar was exactly what you'd expect from a 5-star Swiss hotel: crystal glasses, imported whiskey, and bartenders who could make drinks that cost more than most people's daily wages. I ordered a scotch that was older than some of my clients and settled in to wait. Zurich at night was a different city from Zurich during the day, quieter, more intimate, with the kind of atmosphere that made expensive conversations feel natural. The hotel bar attracted a clientele that included international business executives, wealthy tourists, and local residents who could afford to pay hotel prices for the privilege of drinking in an environment that excluded anyone who couldn't afford hotel prices. At 8:30 p.m., Victoria Brennan walked into the restaurant wearing a dress that probably cost more than her husband's monthly salary. She was more beautiful than her family photographs had suggested, but there was something about her posture that seemed artificial, like someone playing a role she hadn't quite mastered. The dress was navy blue silk, cut in a style that was sophisticated without being ostentatious, expensive without being flashy. Her jewelry was understated but clearly valuable. A pearl necklace that caught the light perfectly, earrings that were large enough to be noticed but small enough to be tasteful, and a watch that I recognized as a Swiss-made timepiece that cost more than most people's cars. But what struck me most about Victoria's appearance was how different she looked from the woman I'd seen in family photographs with Michael and the children. In those pictures, she'd looked like a suburban housewife who was trying to project sophistication but hadn't quite mastered the art. In the hotel restaurant, she looked like someone who'd been born to wealth and sophistication, someone who belonged in 5-star hotels and international business meetings. Klaus Weber was everything his photograph had promised and more. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of European sophistication that made American money look provincial. He moved through the restaurant like he owned it, greeting the staff by name and choosing a table that provided privacy while maintaining visibility of the restaurant's entrance and exits. Klaus was maybe 45, with silver hair that was perfectly styled, a tan that suggested regular vacations in expensive locations, and clothes that were clearly custom-made by tailors who charged more for alterations than most people spent on entire wardrobes. His watch was a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than Michael Brennan's annual salary, and his shoes were handmade Italian leather that showed no signs of ever having walked on anything rougher than marble floors. But more than his appearance, it was Klaus's demeanor that marked him as someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He spoke to the waitstaff with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of having people eager to please you, and he chose wine with the confidence of someone who'd never had to check prices before making decisions. I watched them have dinner and tried to read their body language. Victoria seemed nervous, excited, constantly checking her phone and looking around the restaurant like she expected someone to be watching her. Klaus seemed calm, professional, occasionally reaching across the table to touch her hand in a gesture that looked more reassuring than romantic. Their conversation was intense but quiet, the kind of discussion that involved documents, calculations, and careful planning. Klaus pulled out a thin leather portfolio and showed Victoria several papers, pointing to specific sections and explaining something that required Victoria to take notes in a small notebook that she'd brought with her. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't a romantic affair. It was a business meeting between two people who were planning something that required precision and secrecy. The way Klaus reviewed documents with Victoria reminded me of lawyers preparing clients for testimony, or accountants explaining tax strategies to people who weren't familiar with financial complexities. After dinner, they walked through the hotel lobby toward the elevators, but instead of going upstairs together, Klaus handed Victoria an envelope and kissed her cheek like a business associate rather than a lover. She went upstairs alone while he left the hotel through the main entrance, walking with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had other appointments to keep. I followed Klaus through the streets of Zurich, grateful for the dim lighting that made surveillance easier, but concerned about the late hour and the fact that I was following a potential criminal through a foreign city, where I didn't speak the language or understand the local laws. Klaus walked for 6 blocks through narrow streets lined with medieval buildings that had been converted into banks, law offices, and the kind of exclusive shops that didn't display prices in their windows. The architecture was a fascinating mixture of old and new, ancient stone buildings that housed modern businesses, narrow streets that accommodated both pedestrians and cars, and a general sense that the city had been updating itself gradually for centuries without losing its essential character. He stopped at a building that housed several businesses, used a key to enter through a side door, and disappeared inside. The building directory showed that Klaus Weber operated his investment consulting business from a third-floor office, sharing the space with a law firm that specialized in international estate planning and a financial services company that helped wealthy clients manage offshore assets. The next morning, I decided to learn more about the neighborhood where Klaus conducted his business. The area was clearly Zurich's financial district. Every building housed banks, investment firms, law offices, or consulting companies that catered to wealthy international clients. The streets were lined with expensive cars, the sidewalks were crowded with well-dressed business people, and every restaurant and cafe seemed designed for the kind of expensive meals that were written off as business expenses. I spent 2 hours walking through the area, getting a feel for the rhythm of the business day and identifying locations where I could conduct surveillance without attracting attention. The challenge was that American tourists were uncommon in this part of Zurich. Most visitors stayed in the more picturesque areas near the lake or the old town, leaving the financial district to business people who had legitimate reasons for being there. This became apparent when I attempted to have lunch at a restaurant near Klaus's office building. The maitre d' took one look at my off-the-rack suit and tourist guidebook and suggested that I might be more comfortable at one of the establishments near the train station that catered to international visitors. "Our restaurant serves primarily business clientele," he explained in English that was polite but unmistakably dismissive. "The menu is designed for local tastes, and the prices reflect our location in Zurich's financial center." The subtext was clear. This restaurant was for people who belonged in Zurich's financial center, and I obviously didn't belong there. I ended up eating lunch at a small cafe that served sandwiches and coffee to office workers who couldn't afford the expensive restaurants but needed something more substantial than vending machine food. The cafe was exactly what I needed: unpretentious, moderately priced, and located where I could observe Klaus's building without being obvious about it. It was during lunch that I overheard a conversation that gave me my first real insight into Klaus Weber's reputation in Zurich's business community. Two men at the table next to mine were discussing a mutual acquaintance who'd recently lost money in what they described as a legacy consulting scheme. "Hans should have known better than to trust someone like Weber," one man said in English that carried a strong German accent. "Anyone who promises to help you claim inheritances from relatives you've never met is probably not operating a legitimate business." How much did Hans lose? 50,000 francs for consulting fees, plus whatever money he thought he was going to inherit from some American uncle he'd never heard of before Weber contacted him. And Weber disappeared after collecting the fees? Weber's still in business, still advertising his services, still convincing people that he can help them claim money from dead relatives. But Hans never saw any inheritance money, and Weber stopped returning his phone calls after the initial consultation period ended. The conversation continued for several more minutes, providing details about Klaus Weber's business model that confirmed my suspicions about his relationship with Victoria. Klaus specialized in convincing people that they were entitled to inheritances from wealthy relatives, collecting substantial fees for legal and consulting services, then disappearing when the promised inheritances failed to materialize. But the most troubling part of the conversation was the suggestion that Klaus had been running this scheme for several years with multiple victims, apparently with little interference from Swiss authorities. "Why doesn't someone report Weber to the police?" I asked the men at the next table, hoping that my obvious American accent would make my interest seem like tourist curiosity rather than investigative inquiry. "Weber is very careful about staying within legal boundaries," one of the men replied. "He never guarantees that inheritance claims will be successful, only that he'll provide consulting services. When the claims fail, he can always blame bureaucratic complications or insufficient documentation." And Swiss law enforcement? Swiss law enforcement is excellent at investigating crimes that have clearly been committed, but Weber's activities exist in a gray area between legitimate consulting and outright fraud. Unless someone can prove that he's knowingly filing false claims, he's probably not violating any laws that Swiss authorities can prosecute. This information gave me a much clearer picture of what Victoria had gotten herself involved with. Klaus wasn't just planning to help her claim Robert's inheritance. He was planning to use her to file fraudulent inheritance claims while protecting himself from criminal liability by maintaining plausible deniability about the legitimacy of those claims. I spent the rest of the afternoon conducting surveillance on both Victoria and Klaus, trying to understand their relationship and their business activities. What I discovered was a sophisticated operation that involved multiple trips to Swiss banks, meetings with lawyers who specialized in inheritance law, and constant communication with people whose voices I could hear through hotel walls, but whose identities I couldn't determine. Victoria's daily routine was carefully structured and obviously planned in advance. She spent mornings at the hotel, apparently studying documents and making phone calls. She spent afternoons meeting with various Swiss professionals, lawyers, bankers, notaries, who specialized in the kinds of legal procedures that would be required to claim a substantial inheritance. But what struck me most about Victoria's activities was how nervous she seemed throughout the process. Unlike Klaus, who moved through his daily routine with confident professionalism, Victoria appeared to be constantly worried about making mistakes, forgetting important details, or saying something that would expose whatever deception they were planning. This became apparent during my surveillance of one of Victoria's meetings with a Swiss inheritance lawyer. I positioned myself in a cafe across the street from the law office, using a telephoto lens to photograph Victoria entering and leaving the building while trying to read her body language and facial expressions. Victoria spent 2 hours in the law office, and when she emerged, she looked like someone who'd just completed a very difficult examination that she wasn't sure she'd passed. Her posture was tense. Her facial expression was strained, and she spent several minutes standing outside the building making phone calls that appeared to involve heated discussions with whoever was on the other end of the line. When Klaus arrived to meet Victoria outside the law office, their conversation was clearly an argument, though I couldn't hear the details from my surveillance position. Klaus seemed frustrated with Victoria's performance during her meeting with the lawyer, while Victoria seemed defensive about whatever mistakes she might have made. The argument continued for 10 minutes, with Klaus occasionally pointing toward the law office building and Victoria shaking her head as if she were refusing to do something that Klaus wanted her to do. Finally, Klaus took Victoria's arm and led her away from the building, but their body language suggested that the disagreement hadn't been resolved. But I also discovered something that Victoria and Klaus apparently didn't expect. Robert Brennan was still alive. This discovery came about almost by accident when I decided to use my remaining time in Zurich to do some basic research about American expatriates living in Switzerland. The American consulate in Zurich maintains a registry of American citizens living in the country, partly for emergency notification purposes and partly to assist with various legal and administrative issues that arise when Americans live abroad for extended periods. The consular official who helped me with this research was a woman named Jennifer Collins, a Foreign Service officer who'd been stationed in Zurich for 3 years and had extensive experience helping American families navigate Swiss legal procedures. Mr. Hunt, I can't provide you with specific information about American citizens without proper authorization, she explained when I inquired about Robert Brennan. But I can tell you that if an American citizen dies in Switzerland, we're required to notify next of kin and assist with repatriation procedures. What if an American citizen dies but no one reports the death to consular authorities? That would be highly unusual. Swiss authorities are very thorough about documenting deaths and notifying appropriate officials. If an American citizen died in Switzerland without consular notification, it would suggest either administrative error or deliberate concealment. What about inheritance procedures for American citizens who die in Switzerland? Swiss inheritance law is very complex, especially for foreign nationals. Most Americans living in Switzerland maintain wills that specify how their assets should be distributed, and Swiss authorities work with American consular officials to ensure that inheritance procedures comply with both Swiss and American legal requirements. Would it be possible for someone to claim an inheritance from an American citizen without proper documentation of that person's death? Jennifer Collins's expression became considerably more serious. Mr. Hunt, are you investigating inheritance fraud involving American citizens in Switzerland? I'm investigating what might be inheritance fraud involving American citizens in Switzerland. In that case, you should speak with Inspector Mueller, who specializes in international financial crimes. Swiss authorities take inheritance fraud very seriously, especially when it involves foreign nationals who might not understand Swiss legal procedures. That afternoon, I contacted Inspector Mueller and arranged a meeting for the following day. But first, I decided to do some additional research about Robert Brennan's current status using resources that didn't require official authorization or administrative procedures. I started with Swiss telephone directories, which are publicly available and include listings for both Swiss citizens and foreign residents. Robert Brennan was listed at an address in Herleberg, a wealthy suburb on the east side of Lake Zurich that was known for expensive houses, international residents, and the kind of privacy that wealthy people valued. The address was for a private nursing home called Alpenblick, which advertised itself as providing luxury care for discerning residents and discreet assistance for international families. The facility's website showed photographs of elegant rooms with lake views, gourmet dining services, and recreational activities that included guided tours of Swiss cultural attractions. I called Alpenblick and asked to speak with Robert Brennan, not knowing what to expect, but hoping that a direct approach might provide the clearest answer about his current status. "May I ask who is calling?" the receptionist asked in English that carried a slight Swiss accent. "My name is Riley Hunt. I'm a private investigator working on behalf of Robert's nephew in the United States. The family has lost touch with Robert and asked me to contact him while I was visiting Switzerland." "Mr. Brennan is currently in residence here at Alpenblick. Would you like me to ask if he's available to speak with you?" 5 minutes later, I was talking to Robert Brennan himself, and it was immediately clear that reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. "You're working for Michael?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the kind of energy that suggested someone who was alert, engaged, and definitely alive. "How is my nephew? I haven't heard from him in years." "He's well, Mr. Brennan. He's a teacher now, has 2 children. He asked me to look you up while I was in Switzerland on business." "A teacher? That's wonderful. My brother always said Michael was the smart one in the family. And children. I'd love to meet them someday." I spent 20 minutes talking with Robert, ostensibly getting reacquainted on behalf of Michael's family, but actually gathering information that would be crucial for understanding Victoria's fraud scheme. Robert was 78 years old, sharp-minded despite his age, and surprised to learn that someone from America was asking about him. But more importantly, Robert was clearly very much alive and completely unaware that anyone might be planning to fake his death in order to steal his inheritance. "Mr. Brennan, when was the last time you updated your will or made contact with any lawyers about your estate?" "Oh, must be 10 years now. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about Swiss legal procedures. As an American, I find the system here quite different from what we're used to." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Swiss law is very thorough, very precise. When I first moved here, I had to learn that everything must be documented, everything must be official. My lawyer helped me establish a will that would provide for my family in America if anything happened to me." "Your family in America?" "Well, Michael's family. He's my only remaining relative. I've done quite well for myself over the years. Engineering, consulting, some successful investments. I always intended to leave everything to Michael, but we lost touch and I wasn't sure how to find him." I felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Robert Brennan was a wealthy man with a substantial estate, no children of his own, and a will that left everything to Michael's family. If someone could fake Robert's death and establish Michael's family relationship, they could claim an inheritance worth millions of Swiss francs. "Mr. Brennan, has anyone contacted you recently about estate planning or family relationships? Any lawyers or consultants who wanted to help you update your will?" "Funny you should ask. Just last month, the young woman came to visit me. Said she was researching American families living in Switzerland for some kind of genealogy project. Asked a lot of questions about my family back home, whether I had children, what my relationship with my nephew was like." "Do you remember her name?" "She said her name was Victoria. Very nice young woman, very interested in family connections." That evening, I called Michael from my hotel room and explained what I'd discovered. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was planning to commit international fraud by faking his uncle's death and claiming an inheritance that was legitimately his. Mr. Hunt, this is insane. Victoria doesn't even know about Uncle Robert. I've barely mentioned him over the years. She knows about him now, and she knows he's wealthy, has no children, and hasn't been in contact with your family for years. It's the perfect setup for a legacy fraud scheme. What do? We prove that Robert is alive, document Victoria's fraud scheme, and make sure the Swiss authorities understand what's happening before she can file any legal claims. And my children? If we can prove that Victoria is planning to commit international fraud, we can prevent her from taking Emma and James anywhere. But we need to move quickly. The conversation with Michael lasted for an hour, during which I explained the details of Klaus Weber's business model, the sophistication of the fraud scheme that Victoria had become involved with, and the potential consequences for everyone involved if the scheme succeeded or failed. But I also had to explain something that was harder for Michael to understand. Victoria wasn't the mastermind of this operation. She was being manipulated by someone much more sophisticated than herself, someone who'd convinced her that stealing from her husband's family was actually helping her own family. Michael, I don't think Victoria fully understands what she's gotten herself involved with. Klaus Weber is a professional criminal who specializes in manipulating people like Victoria, people who are dissatisfied with their current financial situation and willing to take risks to improve their circumstances. Are you saying that Victoria is a victim too? I'm saying that Victoria is both a victim and a perpetrator. Klaus is using her to commit fraud, but she's also choosing to participate in that fraud. The question is whether she understands the full implications of what she's doing. What do you think will happen to her if she gets caught? That depends on how much evidence the Swiss authorities can gather, how cooperative she is with their investigation, and whether Klaus abandons her when things go wrong. And Klaus? Klaus will probably disappear the moment he realizes that his scheme has been exposed. Men like him don't stick around to face the consequences of their actions. The next day, I contacted Inspector Muller and explained the situation in detail. Muller was a detective in his 50s who specialized in financial crimes involving international fraud, and he listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism that good detectives develop after years of hearing elaborate theories from people who watch too many crime shows. Mr. Hunt, what you're describing is certainly possible, but proving fraud requires evidence of criminal intent, not just suspicious behavior. I have photographs of Victoria meeting with Klaus Weber, documents showing their financial planning activities, and witness testimony from Robert Brennan that Victoria interviewed him under false pretenses. That's a good start, but Swiss law requires very specific procedures for prosecuting international fraud cases. We'll need to coordinate with American authorities, document the chain of evidence, and ensure that any arrests we make will stand up in court. Muller was a thorough, methodical investigator who understood that international financial crimes required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. He explained that Swiss authorities took inheritance fraud very seriously, but that prosecuting such cases required extensive documentation and careful adherence to legal procedures that protected both victims and defendants. Inspector Muller, Victoria and Klaus are scheduled to meet with Swiss inheritance lawyers tomorrow. If they file fraudulent claims, won't that provide the evidence you need to make arrests? Filing fraudulent inheritance claims would certainly provide evidence of criminal intent, but it would also mean that the fraud had been completed, which could complicate efforts to recover stolen assets or prevent additional crimes. What do you recommend? I recommend that we coordinate our investigation with American authorities and attempt to gather additional evidence before Victoria and Klaus complete their fraud scheme. If we can document their activities without alerting them to our investigation, we might be able to prevent the fraud rather than just prosecuting it after the fact. Mueller assigned 2 officers to assist with surveillance of Victoria and Klaus, but he warned me that Swiss police procedures were more formal and time-consuming than what I was used to in Miami. In Switzerland, we believe that justice delayed is often justice preserved, Mueller said. We would rather build a perfect case slowly than rush to make arrests that might not result in convictions. How long do you think this investigation will take? That depends on how quickly we can gather evidence and how cooperative American authorities are with our requests for assistance. And if Victoria and Klaus attempt to file inheritance claims before your investigation is complete, then we'll have to make arrests based on whatever evidence we have available, even if that evidence might not be sufficient for successful prosecution. The next afternoon, I discovered that Victoria and Klaus were planning to accelerate their timeline. Through hotel staff who were willing to share information for appropriate compensation, I learned that Victoria had scheduled meetings with 3 different law firms for the following day, all of which specialized in Swiss inheritance law. This information suggested that Victoria and Klaus were planning to file multiple inheritance claims simultaneously, probably as insurance against the possibility that one or more of their fraudulent applications might be rejected for procedural reasons. I positioned myself outside the first law firm, a prestigious practice that occupied an entire building near the Swiss National Bank. The building was exactly what you'd expect from Zurich's legal establishment: stone facade, brass nameplate, and an entrance that suggested the kind of serious business that required serious money. Victoria arrived at 10 a.m. carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of conservative outfit that suggested she was playing the role of a grieving relative rather than a woman planning to commit fraud. Her dress was black wool, expensive but not flashy, and her jewelry was limited to a simple pearl necklace and wedding ring. She looked like someone who was dealing with the difficult task of handling a deceased relative's affairs, which was exactly the impression she was trying to create. Klaus arrived separately, through a side entrance, apparently trying to avoid being seen with Victoria during her legal consultations. But I was able to photograph them together in the building's lobby, document their coordination, and establish a timeline that would be crucial for proving their conspiracy. The meeting lasted for 2 hours, and when Victoria emerged from the building, she looked like someone who'd just completed a very stressful performance. Her confident posture had been replaced by obvious nervousness, and she spent several minutes on the phone with someone who was apparently giving her instructions for her next appointment. At the second law firm, I got lucky. The building's security was modern enough to include surveillance cameras, but old-fashioned enough that the cameras were visible from the street. I was able to position myself where I could photograph Victoria entering the building while wearing a wire that would record any conversations that took place near the building's entrance. What I heard was Victoria practicing her story, how her husband Michael had recently learned of his uncle's death, how the family was devastated by their loss, how she was hoping to handle the estate matters quickly so that Michael could focus on grieving rather than legal procedures. But I also heard something that surprised me. Victoria sounded nervous, uncertain, like someone who was following a script she didn't entirely understand. Her responses to Klaus's coaching were hesitant, and she asked questions that suggested she wasn't fully committed to the fraud scheme. "Klaus, what if Michael finds out what we're doing? What if he tries to stop us?" "Victoria, your husband is a high school teacher who's never been outside of Florida. By the time he understands what's happening, we'll be living in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States. And the children? Emma and James don't speak German. They don't understand why I want to move to Europe. The children will adapt. Rich children always adapt. And once Michael realizes how much money is involved, he'll probably thank us for taking initiative while he was too passive to act. I never thought it would be this complicated. When you first explained the plan, it seemed simpler. Victoria, you married a man who was satisfied with mediocrity. You have the chance to give your children opportunities that Michael's salary could never provide. Sometimes taking those opportunities requires difficult decisions. But what if we get caught? What if the lawyers figure out that Uncle Robert isn't really dead? Victoria, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know how to create documentation that will satisfy Swiss legal requirements. The lawyers aren't investigators, they're bureaucrats who process paperwork. As long as our paperwork is correct, they won't question the underlying facts. Listening to that conversation, I realized that Victoria wasn't the calculating criminal I'd initially thought she was. She was a woman who'd been manipulated by someone much more sophisticated than herself, someone who'd convinced her that stealing from her husband's family was actually helping her own family. But the conversation also revealed something that Klaus apparently hadn't shared with Victoria. His plan didn't include a long-term relationship with her. His references to "we'll be living in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties" suggested that he was planning to disappear once the inheritance fraud was completed, leaving Victoria to face the consequences alone. This realization changed my approach to the investigation. Victoria wasn't just a perpetrator of fraud. She was also a potential victim of someone who was using her to commit crimes that she didn't fully understand. That evening, I arranged a conference call between Michael, Inspector Mueller, and myself to discuss our options for preventing Victoria from filing fraudulent inheritance claims. "The good news," Mueller said, "is that we have enough evidence to arrest both Victoria and Klaus for conspiracy to commit fraud. The bad news is that Swiss legal procedures require us to notify American authorities before making arrests involving American citizens." "How long will that take?" Michael asked. 48 to 72 hours, assuming American authorities cooperate quickly." "Inspector Mueller," I said, "Victoria is scheduled to file inheritance claims tomorrow morning. If we wait for international coordination, she might complete the fraud before we can stop her. Then we'll have to take the risk of making arrests without full coordination." "But Mr. Brennan, you need to understand that this decision could affect your wife's legal status and your children's custody situation in ways that we can't predict." Michael was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Inspector, my wife is planning to steal money from my family and kidnap my children. Whatever legal complications result from stopping her can't be worse than losing Emma and James forever." "There's one more option," I said. "Instead of arresting Victoria and Klaus before they file inheritance claims, we could allow them to file fraudulent claims and then arrest them for completed fraud rather than conspiracy to commit fraud." "What would be the advantage of that approach?" Mueller asked. "Completed fraud carries heavier penalties than conspiracy to commit fraud. If we allow Victoria and Klaus to actually file false inheritance claims, we can prosecute them for more serious crimes and potentially recover damages for other victims of Klaus's schemes." "And the disadvantage?" "The disadvantage is that once Victoria files fraudulent inheritance claims, she'll have committed a serious felony that could result in a lengthy prison sentence and permanent separation from her children." Michael considered this option for several minutes before responding. "Mr. Hunt, if Victoria completes this fraud scheme, what kind of sentence would she be facing?" "In Switzerland, inheritance fraud involving amounts over 1 million francs carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison, with possible sentences up to 20 years depending on the circumstances." "And if we stop her before she completes the fraud?" "Conspiracy to commit fraud carries lighter sentences, typically 2 to 5 years, with possibility of probation for first-time offenders who cooperate with authorities." "Inspector Mueller, what do you recommend?" "I recommend that we attempt to arrest Victoria and Klaus before they complete the fraud, both to minimize their legal exposure and to prevent them from actually stealing money that belongs to your family." The next morning, Swiss police arrested Victoria Brennan and Klaus Weber as they were leaving the offices of Bergman and Associates, a law firm that specialized in Swiss inheritance claims. Victoria was carrying documents that identified her as Michael Brennan's legal representative, authorized to claim Robert Brennan's estate on behalf of the family. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that included death certificates, family genealogy records, and power of attorney forms that would have given Victoria complete control over an inheritance worth nearly 3 million Swiss francs. But Klaus Weber had more than just Victoria's case in his briefcase. Police found evidence of at least 6 other legacy fraud schemes involving American, British, and Canadian families who'd been targeted because they'd lost touch with wealthy relatives living in Switzerland. The most damaging evidence, however, was a recording device that Klaus had been carrying, apparently documenting his conversations with Victoria for purposes that weren't immediately clear. The recording revealed that Klaus had been planning to eliminate Victoria as a witness once the inheritance fraud was completed, keeping all the money for himself while leaving her to face criminal charges alone. "I really thought Klaus cared about me," Victoria said during her initial police interview, which I was allowed to observe as a witness. "I thought we were building a future together. I never realized that he was just using me to steal from my own family." "You're Michael's friend?" he asked when I introduced myself. "How is my nephew? I haven't heard from him in years." "He's well, Mr. Brennan. He's a teacher now, has 2 children. He asked me to look you up while I was in Switzerland on business." Robert's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "A teacher? That's wonderful. My brother always said Michael was the smart one in the family. And children. I'd love to meet them someday. Mr. Brennan, when was the last time you updated your will or made contact with any lawyers about your estate?" "Oh, must be 10 years now. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about Swiss legal procedures. As an American, I find the system here quite different from what we're used to." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Swiss law is very thorough, very precise. When I first moved here, I had to learn that everything must be documented. Everything must be official. My lawyer helped me establish a will that would provide for my family in America if anything happened to me." "Your family in America?" "Well, Michael's family. He's my only remaining relative. I've done quite well for myself over the years. Engineering consulting, some successful investments. I always intended to leave everything to Michael, but we lost touch and I wasn't sure how to find him." I felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Robert Brennan was a wealthy man with a substantial estate, no children of his own, and a will that left everything to Michael's family. If someone could fake Robert's death and establish Michael's family relationship, they could claim an inheritance worth millions of Swiss francs. "Mr. Brennan, has anyone contacted you recently about estate planning or family relationships? Any lawyers or consultants who wanted to help you update your will?" "Funny you should ask. Just last month, a young woman came to visit me. Said she was researching American families living in Switzerland for some kind of genealogy project. Asked a lot of questions about my family back home, whether I had children, what my relationship with my nephew was like." "Do you remember her name?" "She said her name was Victoria. Very nice young woman, very interested in family connections." That evening I called Michael from my hotel room and explained what I'd discovered. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was planning to commit international fraud by faking his uncle's death and claiming an inheritance that was legitimately his. "Mr. Hunt, this is insane. Victoria doesn't even know about Uncle Robert. I've barely mentioned him over the years. She knows about him now, and she knows he's wealthy, has no children, and hasn't been in contact with your family for years. It's the perfect setup for a legacy fraud scheme." "What do we do?" "We prove that Robert is alive, document Victoria's fraud scheme, and make sure the Swiss authorities understand what's happening before she can file any legal claims." "And my children?" If we can prove that Victoria is planning to commit international fraud, we can prevent her from taking Emma and James anywhere. But we need to move quickly. The next day, I contacted the Swiss police and explained the situation to a detective named Inspector Mueller, who specialized in financial crimes involving international fraud. Mueller was a serious man in his 50s who listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism that good detectives develop after years of hearing elaborate theories from people who watch too many crime shows. "Mr. Hunt, what you're describing is certainly possible. But proving fraud requires evidence of criminal intent, not just suspicious behavior. I have photographs of Victoria meeting with Klaus Weber, documents showing their financial planning activities, and witness testimony from Robert Brennan that Victoria interviewed him under false pretenses." That's a good start. But Swiss law requires very specific procedures for prosecuting international fraud cases. We'll need to coordinate with American authorities, document the chain of evidence, and ensure that any arrests we make will stand up in court. Mueller assigned 2 officers to assist with surveillance of Victoria and Klaus, but he warned me that Swiss police procedures were more formal and time-consuming than what I was used to in Miami. "In Switzerland, we believe that justice delayed is often justice preserved," Mueller said. "We would rather build a perfect case slowly than rush to make arrests that might not result in convictions." That afternoon, I discovered that Victoria and Klaus were planning to accelerate their timeline. Through hotel staff who were willing to share information for appropriate compensation, I learned that Victoria had scheduled meetings with 3 different law firms for the following day, all of which specialized in Swiss inheritance law. I positioned myself outside the first law firm, a prestigious practice that occupied an entire building near the Swiss National Bank. Victoria arrived at 10 a.m. carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of conservative outfit that suggested she was playing the role of a grieving relative rather than a woman planning to commit fraud. Klaus arrived separately through a side entrance, apparently trying to avoid being seen with Victoria during her legal consultations. But I was able to photograph them together in the building's lobby, document their coordination, and establish a timeline that would be crucial for proving their conspiracy. At the second law firm, I got lucky. The building's security was modern enough to include surveillance cameras, but old-fashioned enough that the cameras were visible from the street. I was able to position myself where I could photograph Victoria entering the building while wearing a wire that would record any conversations that took place near the building's entrance. What I heard was Victoria practicing her story. How her husband Michael had recently learned of his uncle's death, how the family was devastated by their loss, how she was hoping to handle the estate matters quickly so that Michael could focus on grieving rather than legal procedures. But I also heard something that surprised me. Victoria sounded nervous, uncertain, like someone who was following a script she didn't entirely understand. Her responses to Klaus's coaching were hesitant, and she asked questions that suggested she wasn't fully committed to the fraud scheme. "Klaus, what if Michael finds out what we're doing? What if he tries to stop us?" "Victoria, your husband is a high school teacher who's never been outside of Florida. By the time he understands what's happening, we'll be living in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States. And the children? Emma and James don't speak German. They don't understand why I want to move to Europe. The children will adapt. Rich children always adapt. And once Michael realizes how much money is involved, he'll probably thank us for taking initiative while he was too passive to act. I never thought it would be this complicated. When you first explained the plan, it seemed simpler. Victoria, you married a man who was satisfied with mediocrity. You have the chance to give your children opportunities that Michael's salary could never provide. Sometimes taking those opportunities requires difficult decisions. Listening to that conversation, I realized that Victoria wasn't the calculating criminal I'd initially thought she was. She was a woman who'd been manipulated by someone much more sophisticated than herself. someone who'd convinced her that stealing from her husband's family was actually helping her own family. That didn't excuse what she was planning to do, but it explained why her behavior seemed inconsistent and why she appeared nervous rather than confident about the fraud scheme. That evening, I arranged a conference call between Michael, Inspector Mueller, and myself to discuss our options for preventing Victoria from filing fraudulent inheritance claims. "The good news," Mueller said, "is that we have enough evidence to arrest both Victoria and Klaus for conspiracy to commit fraud. The bad news is that Swiss legal procedures require us to notify American authorities before making arrests involving American citizens." "How long will that take?" Michael asked. 48 to 72 hours, assuming American authorities cooperate quickly." "Inspector Mueller," I said, "Victoria is scheduled to file inheritance claims tomorrow morning. If we wait for international coordination, she might complete the fraud before we can stop her. Then we'll have to take the risk of making arrests without full coordination. But Mr. Brennan, you need to understand that this decision could affect your wife's legal status and your children's custody situation in ways that we can't predict." Michael was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Inspector, my wife is planning to steal money from my family and kidnap my children. Whatever legal complications result from stopping her can't be worse than losing Emma and James forever." The next morning, Swiss police arrested Victoria Brennan and Klaus Weber as they were leaving the offices of Bergman and Associates, a law firm that specialized in Swiss inheritance claims. Victoria was carrying documents that identified her as Michael Brennan's legal representative, authorized to claim Robert Brennan's estate on behalf of the family. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that included death certificates, family genealogy records, and power of attorney forms that would have given Victoria complete control over an inheritance worth nearly 3 million Swiss francs. Klaus Weber had more than just Victoria's case in his briefcase. Police found evidence of at least 6 other legacy fraud schemes involving American, British, and Canadian families who'd been targeted because they'd lost touch with wealthy relatives living in Switzerland. But the most damaging evidence was a recording device that Klaus had been carrying, apparently documenting his conversations with Victoria for purposes that weren't immediately clear. The recording revealed that Klaus had been planning to eliminate Victoria as a witness once the inheritance fraud was completed, keeping all the money for himself while leaving her to face criminal charges alone. "I really thought Klaus cared about me," Victoria said during her initial police interview, which I was allowed to observe as a witness. "I thought we were building a future together. I never realized that he was just using me to steal from my own family." Inspector Mueller conducted the interview with the kind of professional courtesy that Swiss police were known for, but his questions were thorough and left no room for Victoria to minimize her participation in the fraud scheme. "Mrs. Brennan, did you know that your husband's Uncle Robert is still alive?" "Klaus told me he was dead. He showed me documents, death certificates. I never thought to verify them independently." "Did you understand that claiming an inheritance from a living person constitutes fraud under Swiss law?" Victoria started crying. "I just wanted to provide financial security for my children. Michael's salary as a teacher, we were always struggling, always worried about money. Klaus said this was an opportunity to give Emma and James the kind of life they deserved." "Did you plan to share the inheritance with your husband?" "Klaus said that Michael was too conservative, too limited in his thinking to understand international opportunities. He said we should handle the inheritance ourselves and present Michael with the results." "Mrs. Brennan, did you plan to return to the United States after claiming the inheritance?" Victoria stopped crying and looked directly at Inspector Mueller. "No. Klaus had arranged for us to relocate to a country where we could live comfortably without worrying about American taxes or legal complications." "What about your husband? Did you plan to include him in this relocation?" Klaus said that Michael could join us later after he understood how much better our lives could be. But honestly, I think I'd fallen out of love with Michael years ago. I thought Klaus was offering me a chance to start over with someone who shared my ambitions. 3 days later, I accompanied Robert Brennan to the police station, where he formally identified himself as the living owner of the estate that Victoria and Klaus had been planning to steal. Robert was surprisingly good-humored about the entire situation, treating it as an interesting adventure rather than a personal violation. "It's quite flattering to learn that my estate is valuable enough to justify international fraud," he said as we signed paperwork that would formally document the failed scheme. "Though I'm disappointed that Victoria didn't simply contact me directly. I've been hoping to reconnect with Michael's family for years. Mr. Brennan, would you be interested in meeting your nephew and his children?" "Nothing would make me happier. I've been living alone for too long, and I'd love to know that my money will eventually benefit family members who actually deserve it." That afternoon, I arranged a video call between Robert and Michael that turned into a 3-hour conversation covering 20 years of missed family history. Michael's children, Emma and James, were initially shy about talking to a great-uncle they'd never heard of, but Robert's gentle humor and genuine interest in their lives quickly won them over. "Uncle Robert," Emma said during the call, "are you really rich like Mom said?" "I've been fortunate in my investments, Emma, but more importantly, I'm rich in family connections that I'd forgotten I had." "Will you come visit us in America?" James asked. "Actually, I was hoping you might come visit me in Switzerland. I have a house in the mountains with wonderful views, and I think you'd enjoy seeing how different life is here." Michael looked like he was about to cry. "Robert, I'm sorry we lost touch. I should have made more effort to stay in contact." "Michael, you were building a family and a career. I was focused on business and making money. Now we have the chance to combine our priorities and create something better for Emma and James." The legal resolution of Victoria's case was more complicated than I'd expected. Swiss authorities were willing to prosecute Klaus Weber for multiple counts of fraud, but Victoria's situation was more ambiguous because she'd been manipulated by someone more sophisticated than herself. Inspector Mueller explained the options to Michael during a meeting at the American consulate in Zurich. "Your wife can plead guilty to conspiracy charges and accept deportation to the United States, where she'll face whatever penalties American courts decide to impose. Or she can fight the charges here in Switzerland, which would require a lengthy legal process and significant financial resources. What do you recommend?" "I recommend that your wife accept deportation and focus on rebuilding her relationship with her children. Klaus Weber will spend the next decade in Swiss prison, but your wife still has the opportunity to be a mother to Emma and James." "Will she accept that option?" "She's already indicated that she wants to return home and try to repair the damage she's caused to your family." But when Victoria finally returned to Miami 3 weeks later, the damage to her family turned out to be more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Emma and James had learned about their mother's fraud scheme through news coverage that had portrayed her as an international criminal, and they were angry, confused, and deeply hurt by her betrayal of their father. "I don't want to live with Mom anymore," Emma told the family court judge during custody hearings that determined the children's future. "She lied to us about everything. She was planning to take us away from Dad forever." James was more direct. "Mom tried to steal from our family. Why would we trust her now?" The custody decision was swift and decisive. Michael was awarded full custody of both children, while Victoria was granted supervised visitation rights that required her to demonstrate financial stability and emotional maturity before any expansion of her parental responsibilities. But Victoria's problems were just beginning. The news coverage of her arrest had cost her the few friends she'd maintained in Miami. Her legal expenses had consumed what little savings the family had accumulated, and her employment prospects were limited by her criminal record and the publicity surrounding her case. 6 months after her return from Switzerland, Victoria was living with her sister Patricia in a mobile home park in Homestead, sharing a space with Patricia's alcoholic husband and 3 young children who treated Victoria like an unwelcome guest rather than family. "I never thought it would end like this," Victoria told me during a chance encounter at a grocery store in Homestead. "I thought I was providing opportunities for my children. Instead, I lost them completely." "What are your plans now?" "I'm working at a call center, making $8 an hour. Patricia lets me sleep on her couch in exchange for babysitting her kids and helping with rent. It's not much of a life, but it's what I deserve after what I did to Michael and the children." "Do you regret the decisions you made?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying the groceries in her cart, generic brands, store coupons, the kind of careful budget shopping that came from having more needs than money. "I regret trusting Klaus. I regret lying to my family. I regret thinking that money was more important than the relationships I already had." She paused. "But mostly I regret that Emma and James will grow up thinking their mother is a criminal who tried to steal from their family." "They might forgive you eventually." "Maybe, but they'll never forget what I did. And neither will I." Meanwhile, Michael's life had been transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. Robert Brennan had not only survived Victoria's fraud scheme, but had emerged from it with renewed energy and purpose. He'd decided to liquidate his Swiss assets and relocate to the United States, where he could spend his remaining years building relationships with the family he'd neglected for too long. Robert purchased a house in Coral Gables, just 20 minutes from Michael's modest home in Kendall. The house was large enough to accommodate frequent visits from Emma and James, and sophisticated enough to host the kind of family gatherings that Michael had never been able to afford. But more importantly, Robert had decided to share his wealth with Michael immediately rather than waiting for inheritance procedures. He established a trust fund that provided financial security for Emma and James's education, set up investment accounts that would allow Michael to retire comfortably, and created a scholarship program at Michael's high school that would help other families afford college education for their children. "Michael," Robert said during one of their weekly family dinners, "I spent 40 years making money but not making memories. You spent 20 years making memories but struggling with money. Together, we can give Emma and James both." The transformation in Michael's life wasn't just financial. With Robert's support, he was able to leave his teaching position and start a consulting business that helped international companies navigate American environmental regulations. His engineering background, combined with his educational experience, made him valuable to Swiss and German companies that were expanding their operations in the United States. Within 2 years, Michael had become wealthy enough to afford the kind of lifestyle that Victoria had been trying to steal. But unlike Victoria's fantasies of European sophistication, Michael's success was built on legitimate work, family relationships, and the kind of gradual prosperity that came from making good decisions rather than criminal ones. The most significant change in Michael's life came when Robert introduced him to Anna Zimmerman, a Swiss woman who'd moved to Miami to manage the American operations of her family's international charity foundation. Anna was 45, had never been married, and was attracted to Michael's combination of intelligence, integrity, and devotion to his children. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with the kind of mutual respect that comes from people who'd learned to value character over appearance, substance over excitement. Anna understood that Michael's priority was his children, and she appreciated that he'd built his new life on honest work rather than inherited wealth. Emma and James, who'd initially been suspicious of any woman who showed interest in their father, quickly discovered that Anna was more interested in being their friend than their replacement mother. She helped Emma with college applications, taught James to ski during family trips to Switzerland, and provided the kind of stable adult relationship that allowed both children to heal from the trauma of their mother's betrayal. 3 years after Victoria's arrest in Switzerland, Michael and Anna were married in a small ceremony at Robert's house in Coral Gables. Emma and James served as wedding attendants. Robert walked Anna down the aisle, and the celebration was everything that Michael's first wedding hadn't been: intimate, genuine, and focused on the future rather than appearances. Victoria wasn't invited to the wedding, but she learned about it through social media posts that showed her former husband and children celebrating with the kind of happiness that she'd tried to steal rather than earn. The photos showed Michael in a custom suit, Emma in a designer dress, James confidently leading toasts, and Anna wearing jewelry that was both expensive and tasteful. "They look so happy," Victoria said to her sister Patricia as they looked at the wedding photos on Patricia's tablet. "Michael never looked that confident when he was married to me." "That's because you spent 20 years telling him he wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't enough." Patricia's voice carried the kind of frustrated honesty that comes from watching family members destroy their own lives. "Anna appreciates what Michael has to offer. You were always focused on what he couldn't provide. I was trying to motivate him to achieve more. You were trying to change him into someone he wasn't." Anna fell in love with who he actually is. 5 years after his divorce from Victoria, Michael Brennan had become everything that Victoria had claimed she wanted in a husband. He was wealthy, internationally connected, and socially prominent in Miami's business community. But his success had come from making wise decisions, building honest relationships, and accepting opportunities that were offered rather than trying to steal opportunities that belonged to others. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family's history. Victoria had destroyed her marriage because she'd believed that Michael wasn't ambitious enough to provide the lifestyle she wanted. But Michael's lack of ambition had actually been integrity, and his satisfaction with modest success had actually been wisdom. With Robert's support and Anna's partnership, Michael had achieved the kind of life that Victoria had been planning to steal. The difference was that Michael's success was sustainable, legitimate, and built on relationships that made him genuinely happy rather than temporarily satisfied. I received an invitation to Michael and Anna's 5th wedding anniversary celebration, which was held at a private club in Coral Gables that catered to Miami's international business community. The event was elegant, but not ostentatious, expensive, but not wasteful, the kind of gathering that celebrated achievement without flaunting wealth. "Mr. Hunt," Michael said when he saw me at the party, "I wanted to thank you again for saving my family. Without your investigation, Victoria would have succeeded in taking Emma and James away from me forever. How are the children adjusting to their new life?" "Emma's a sophomore at Stanford, studying international business. She spends summers in Switzerland working for Anna's foundation. James is a senior in high school, already accepted to MIT for engineering. They've both learned to speak German, and they consider Robert their grandfather and Anna their stepmother." "And Victoria?" Michael's expression became more serious. "She's still living with her sister, still working minimum-wage jobs. Emma and James see her occasionally, but the relationship is complicated. They love her because she's their mother, but they don't trust her because of what she tried to do to our family." "Do you think she's learned from the experience?" "I think she understands the consequences of her choices. Whether she's actually learned from them, that's harder to know." As the anniversary party continued around us, I watched Michael and Anna interact with their guests: business associates, family friends, Emma's college roommate, James's girlfriend, Robert's Swiss relatives who'd flown to Miami for the celebration. It was the kind of social gathering that Victoria had always wanted to host, filled with sophisticated people discussing international business, cultural exchanges, and family traditions that spanned multiple countries. But the most striking thing about the celebration was how genuinely happy everyone seemed. Anna's laughter when Robert told stories about his engineering adventures in Switzerland, Emma's pride when she described her internship with a humanitarian organization. James's excitement when he talked about his plans to study environmental engineering, Michael's quiet satisfaction as he watched his children interact confidently with adults from around the world. This was what Victoria had been trying to steal, not just money, but the kind of life that money could buy when it was earned honestly and shared generously. She'd been planning to take Michael's inheritance and use it to create a sophisticated European lifestyle for herself and her children. Instead, Michael had received that inheritance legitimately, used it to build a sustainable business, and created the kind of international family life that provided his children with opportunities Victoria never could have imagined. The final irony was that Victoria's criminal scheme had actually brought Michael's family closer together than they'd ever been before. Her betrayal had forced Michael to confront his own limitations, accept help from relatives he'd neglected, and build relationships based on honesty rather than obligation. "Mr. Hunt," Anna said as the party was winding down, "Michael told me that you took his case even though he couldn't afford your usual rates. Why did you make that decision?" "Because I'd been in Michael's situation once. I knew what it felt like to lose your children to someone who was planning to take them somewhere you couldn't follow." "Did you ever get your children back?" "No. My ex-wife disappeared with them 15 years ago. I haven't seen them since." Anna was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the kind of warmth that suggested she understood more about family loss than I'd initially realized. "Then helping Michael's family was probably therapeutic for you as well." "It was. Sometimes the best way to heal from your own losses is to prevent other people from suffering the same kind of damage." 6 months after the anniversary party, I received a call from Victoria Brennan, asking if I would meet her for coffee. She was working 2 jobs now, morning shift at a call center, evening shift at a restaurant, and living in a studio apartment that she could barely afford on her combined income. "Mr. Hunt, I wanted to thank you for stopping me from destroying my children's lives," she said when we met at a Starbucks near her apartment. "I know that sounds strange, but I've had 5 years to think about what would have happened if Klaus and I had succeeded." "What do you think would have happened?" "Klaus would have abandoned me once he had the money. Emma and James would have been stranded in Europe with a mother who was a wanted criminal. They never would have had the opportunities that Robert and Anna have provided for them." Victoria looked older than her 50 years, with the kind of tiredness that comes from working jobs that don't provide benefits and living paycheck to paycheck without any prospect of improvement. But there was also something in her eyes that hadn't been there during our previous encounters, a kind of clarity that suggested she'd finally understood the consequences of her choices. "What are your plans now?" "I'm taking night classes in accounting. It'll take 4 years to get my degree, but it's the only way I can qualify for jobs that pay enough to live on. Patricia's husband has been sober for 8 months, so the living situation is more stable than it was." "Do you have any contact with Emma and James?" "They call me on my birthday and Mother's Day. Emma sends me cards from college. James shares his academic achievements with me. It's not much of a relationship, but it's more than I deserve after what I tried to do to them." "Do you think they'll ever forgive you?" Victoria smiled sadly. "They've already forgiven me, Mr. Hunt. They call me, they include me in their important moments, they treat me like their mother even though I don't deserve that kind of grace. What they can't do is trust me, and I understand why." "Trust can be rebuilt." "Maybe, but it takes time, and it requires me to prove that I've actually changed rather than just saying I've changed. Right now, the best thing I can do for Emma and James is to build a stable life for myself so that they don't have to worry about me." "Are you happy?" Victoria considered the question for a long moment. "I'm not happy the way I thought I wanted to be when I was planning to steal from Michael's family. But I'm satisfied in a way that I never was when I was married to Michael. I know who I am now. I understand what I'm capable of. And I'm not pretending to be someone else." "What do you mean?" "When I was married to Michael, I was always frustrated because I thought I deserved a more exciting life than what a teacher's salary could provide. I was constantly comparing our marriage to other people's relationships, always feeling like we were missing something that everyone else had. And now I understand that I wasn't missing anything external. I was missing appreciation for what I already had. Michael was a good husband, a devoted father, and a man who loved me exactly as I was. I threw that away because I thought Klaus was offering me something better. Klaus was offering you stolen money and a criminal lifestyle. Klaus was offering me the fantasy that I could have wealth and sophistication without earning them. The reality is that Michael earned everything he has now: Robert's respect, Anna's love, his children's pride. He earned it by being honest, patient, and committed to his family. Do you regret the choices you made? I regret hurting people I loved. I regret teaching my children that their mother was capable of betraying their father. I regret destroying a marriage that could have been happy if I'd been mature enough to appreciate what I had. But not the consequences? Victoria smiled with something that might have been wisdom. The consequences taught me who I really am and what I'm actually capable of achieving on my own. I needed to lose everything to understand what I'd been taking for granted. A year later, I received a graduation announcement from Emma Brennan, who'd completed her degree at Stanford and accepted a position with an international development organization based in Geneva. The announcement included a family photo that showed Michael, Anna, James, Robert, and Victoria all together at Emma's graduation ceremony. Victoria was standing slightly apart from the rest of the family, but she was included in the photograph, smiling genuinely at her daughter's achievement. She was wearing a simple dress that was probably the nicest thing in her wardrobe, but she looked comfortable rather than out of place. On the back of the announcement, Emma had written a note: Mr. Hunt, thank you for keeping our family together when it could have been destroyed forever. Mom is doing better now, and we're all learning how to be a family again, even though it's complicated. Love, Emma. 6 months after Emma's graduation, James Brennan started his freshman year at MIT, where he planned to study environmental engineering with the goal of working for companies that developed sustainable technology. His tuition was paid by the trust fund that Robert had established, but his expenses were covered by scholarships he'd earned through academic excellence and community service. During James's orientation week, I received a call from Michael asking if I'd be interested in consulting for his environmental regulation business, which had grown large enough to require additional investigative services. I'm expanding into European markets, Michael explained, and I need someone who understands international business practices and has experience working with Swiss authorities. I'd be interested. What kind of consulting are you looking for? Due diligence investigations for American companies that want to partner with European firms. Background checks on potential business associates. The kind of work that requires discretion and cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity isn't usually associated with private investigation. Michael laughed. It is when your wife is Swiss, your business partners are German, and your father-in-law is a retired banker who expects every business decision to be documented in triplicate. The consulting work that Michael offered turned out to be both lucrative and professionally satisfying. His business had grown into a successful international consulting firm that helped American companies navigate European environmental regulations while helping European companies understand American business practices. Working with Michael's firm allowed me to travel regularly to Switzerland, where I'd developed professional relationships with law enforcement officials and business leaders who appreciated the kind of thorough investigation work that American companies required before making international investments. But more importantly, working with Michael allowed me to see the long-term results of a case that had been professionally successful and personally meaningful. Michael's family had not only survived Victoria's betrayal, but had emerged from it stronger, wealthier, and more connected than they'd ever been before. Emma was building a career in international humanitarian work that combined her father's integrity with her great-uncle's business acumen. James was studying technology that would help solve environmental problems while building wealth for investors. Anna was managing a charity foundation that provided education opportunities for children in developing countries. Robert was spending his retirement years teaching his great-niece and great-nephew about Swiss culture, business ethics, and the importance of family relationships. Even Victoria, despite the limited circumstances of her current life, had found a kind of peace that she'd never experienced during her marriage to Michael. She was working toward a degree that would provide professional opportunities, living independently for the first time in her adult life, and building relationships with her children that were based on honesty rather than manipulation. "You know what the strangest part of this whole experience has been?" Michael asked during one of our business meetings in Zurich. "Victoria's betrayal turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to our family." "How do you figure that?" "If Victoria hadn't tried to steal Robert's inheritance, we never would have reconnected with him. Emma and James never would have had the opportunities that Robert's wealth provided. I never would have met Anna. Our family never would have become international. And Victoria never would have learned who she really was underneath the fantasies she'd built about herself." "Exactly. Her criminal scheme forced all of us to confront who we really were and what we actually wanted from life. The results weren't what any of us expected, but they were what we needed." "Do you think Victoria understands that?" "I think Victoria understands that she destroyed one life in order to build a different one. Whether the life she's building now is better than the life she destroyed, that's something she'll have to decide for herself." 3 years after starting his business, Michael Brennan was featured on the cover of International Business Weekly as one of Miami's most successful entrepreneurs. The article described his transition from high school teacher to international consultant, his family's connection to Swiss business interests, and his marriage to Anna Zimmermann, who was described as one of Switzerland's most influential humanitarian leaders. The article included photographs of Michael's family at their home in Coral Gables, at Robert's chalet in the Swiss Alps, and at various business and social events where they'd been photographed with politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who were involved in international environmental initiatives. But the most striking photograph was a family portrait that included Victoria, standing with her children and ex-husband at Emma's college graduation. The caption identified her as the children's mother, who has rebuilt her relationship with the family after serving time for international fraud charges. It was a truthful caption that acknowledged Victoria's criminal history while recognizing her current role as a mother who'd learned from her mistakes and was working to repair the damage she'd caused. "I kept that magazine on my desk for months. Not because of the business publicity it provided for Michael's company, but because it represented something that rarely happened in my line of work, a case where justice was served, families were reunited, and people had the opportunity to become better versions of themselves. Most of the cases I worked on ended with evidence gathered, reports filed, and clients who had answers to questions they'd wished they'd never needed to ask. But Michael's case had ended with a family that was stronger, wealthier, and happier than they'd been before the crisis that had brought them to my office. The last time I saw Victoria Brennan was at James's graduation from MIT, where she sat with her family in the audience, applauding her son's academic achievements, while wearing a nursing uniform from the hospital where she'd recently been hired as an administrative assistant. She'd finally completed her accounting degree and found employment that provided health insurance, retirement benefits, and the kind of professional respectability that allowed her to rebuild her self-esteem. Her relationship with Emma and James had evolved into something that resembled a normal mother-child relationship, though it was still complicated by the history of her betrayal. "Mr. Hunt," she said when she saw me after the graduation ceremony, "I wanted you to know that I'm getting married next month." "Congratulations. Anyone I know?" "His name is David. He's a nurse at the hospital where I work. He knows about my criminal history and he doesn't care. He says everyone deserves a chance to start over. How do Emma and James feel about your relationship? They're cautiously optimistic. David has teenage children from his first marriage, so he understands the complications of blended families. He's not trying to replace Michael as their father, just trying to be a positive influence in my life. Are you happy? Victoria smiled with the kind of genuine contentment that I'd never seen from her before. I'm happy in a way that I didn't know was possible when I was married to Michael. David and I are building something together based on who we actually are, rather than who we think we should be. What do you mean? When I was married to Michael, I was always trying to convince him to become more ambitious, more successful, more like the husband I thought I deserved. With David, I'm trying to become a better version of myself. More honest, more grateful, more focused on building relationships than accumulating things. And that's working? It's working because David fell in love with the person I am now, not the person I was pretending to be when I was married to Michael. He knows I'm capable of making terrible decisions, but he also sees that I'm capable of learning from those decisions and becoming someone better. Do you have any regrets about how your life turned out? Victoria considered the question while watching Michael, Anna, Emma, and James pose for photographs with Robert and David's children who'd been included in the family celebration as honorary relatives. I regret the pain I caused Michael and the children. I regret the years I wasted being dissatisfied with a life that was actually quite good. But I don't regret the consequences of my choices, because those consequences taught me things about myself that I needed to learn. Such as? Such as the fact that contentment comes from appreciating what you have rather than acquiring what you think you want. Such as the fact that real love is based on accepting people as they are, rather than trying to change them into who you think they should be. Those are hard lessons to learn. They're lessons that most people learn through therapy or self-reflection. I learned them through international fraud charges and 5 years of working minimum-wage jobs while watching my family succeed without me. Would you recommend that learning method to others? Victoria laughed for the first time since I'd known her. Definitely not. But sometimes people like me need dramatic consequences to understand truths that wiser people figure out through less destructive methods. As I watched Michael's family celebrate James's graduation, I realized that Victoria's criminal scheme had ultimately created the kind of family happiness that she'd been seeking when she'd first decided that Michael's teacher's salary wasn't enough to satisfy her ambitions. Michael had become wealthy and internationally successful. Emma and James had opportunities that would allow them to build meaningful careers anywhere in the world. Anna had found a partner who shared her values and appreciated her achievements. Robert had reconnected with family members who brought purpose to his retirement years. Even Victoria had found a kind of happiness that was based on realistic expectations, honest relationships, and work that provided both income and satisfaction. The only difference between Victoria's original fantasy and the family's current reality was that the success had been earned through honest work, patient relationship building, and the kind of gradual prosperity that came from making wise decisions rather than criminal ones. It was a lesson that most people learned without having to commit international fraud, lose custody of their children, and spend years rebuilding their lives from scratch. But it was also a lesson that had required Victoria to lose everything she thought she wanted in order to discover what she actually needed. As I drove home from James's graduation, I reflected on a case that had begun with a high school teacher's suspicions about his wife's infidelity and ended with a family that had been transformed by the consequences of betrayal, forgiveness, and the discovery that justice and mercy could coexist in the same story. It was the kind of case that reminded me why I'd become a private investigator in the first place. not just to gather evidence and solve puzzles, but to help people find truth in situations where truth was the foundation for building better lives. Sometimes the truth was painful, sometimes it was complicated, and sometimes it required years of difficult work to understand and accept. But it was always better than the lies that people told themselves when they were trying to avoid the consequences of their choices. My name is Riley Hunt, and this case taught me that sometimes the best way to help a family is to prevent them from destroying themselves, even when preventing that destruction requires exposing painful truths about people who thought they were getting away with perfect crimes. I was back in my office the next week, answering the phone for another client with another problem that probably involved more deception, betrayal, and human complexity than initially appeared. "Hunt Investigations?" I answered. "Mr. Hunt, this is Patricia Morrison. I think my husband might be having an affair." I looked down at my shoes, well-maintained leather that had walked through airports in 3 countries, hotel lobbies where criminals planned international fraud, and family celebrations where justice and mercy had learned to coexist. "Tell me about it, Mrs. Morrison," I said, reaching for my notebook, "and start from the beginning. Because in this business, there's always another beginning. Always another family that needs help finding the truth about themselves. Always another chance to discover that even the most complicated human problems can have solutions if people are brave enough to face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes, if everyone involved is very lucky and very committed to learning from their mistakes, those solutions can create families that are stronger, happier, and more honest than they were before the crisis that brought them to my door."